Good afternoon. I am Kori Shaki. I'm the head of the Foreign and Defense Policy team at the American Enterprise Institute, and it is my great good fortune today to moderate this conversation among three distinguished applied historians, people who think about American history, grand strategy, and how it can and should affect the problems of our day. We are going to talk about the new book by Robert Zoellick, former president of the World Bank and Deputy Secretary of State, senior counselor at the Brunswick book, and he has an outstanding new book called America in the World. And here to cross swords over it are Professor Frank Gavin, the Giovanni Agnelli Distinguished Professor at SAIS. He's the director of the Kissinger Center, also at SAIS, and chairman of the editorial board of the Texas National Security Review. My favorite book of his is Nuclear Statecraft, History and Strategy in America's Atomic Age. And our second discussant is the great Hal Brands, Kissinger Distinguished Professor at SAIS. He's a fellow with me at AEI, a columnist for Bloomberg. And my favorite of his books is Making the Unipolar Moment, American Foreign Policy and the Rise of the Cold War Order. Let's start, Bob, by having you spend some time telling us about this book.
Okay. Well, first, I appreciate the opportunity to be with the three of you. And Kori, let me begin by congratulating you on this post. I'm sure you'll operate with your always energetic and magnetic style and make it a great success. And since we're on an AEI program, I also want to say how I think Michael Strain's work has really added a wonderful contribution. So I hope you can connect with the economic and foreign policy side a little bit. And I'm also wanted to say, I know that Frank and Hal with the Kissinger Center, I think have a great opportunity to make a mark in this field of applied history that I hope we'll talk about a little bit today. So let me start with the beginning, which is why did I write the book? And probably like many people on this call, some 20 years ago, I read Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, which used history to talk about foreign policy. But at the time, I always had a feeling that Dr. Kissinger relied very heavily on the European history and perspective. And so for quite some time, I've been trying to think about how to write something that would approach this from the perspective of American ideas and experience. And so the way I approach this in this book was to focus on people and stories, try to fit with readers who are interested in biographies, and in particular episodes and the practical work of diplomacy. So taking nothing away from political scientists and international relations theorists, but I was trying to emphasize more what I've experienced and how, as I read about history, I think it's made in practice. And I think one of the other ideas I had was that I always enjoyed the field of diplomatic history, but as Frank in particular has written, it's faded a little bit over the years, in part, I think, for understandable reasons that people have wanted to bring in other perspectives and actors. But I think we've lost something in terms of trying to synthesize, or as one historian up at Harvard wrote, why have we stopped teaching political history? And insofar as diplomatic history was still taught, the experience I had with younger colleagues was people might have learned something about World War II and the period afterwards, but the first 150 years of American history was a blank. And that's deeply unfortunate, because I think there's a lot of things one can learn from that experience. And on this whole idea of applied history, in a sense, each chapter of the book could be a form of a case study about how do you try to solve problems? And so I've encouraged people, particularly some for students or others who think in this term, to think about it not only as history, but think of it as a problem-solving exercise, and sort of sense of how do people assess the context, what's going on, what do they want to accomplish, how would they do so? And doing nothing is a choice as well. So there's a theme I use in the book of pragmatism, because I think that's often the reality of how people have to deal with the problems of the day. So I have some 18 chapters, and I won't go through them all, but just to give you an illustrative flavor of what I'm talking about, With Hamilton, I asked the question about how did his statecraft complement his economic design at home? Or for Thomas Jefferson in the Louisiana Purchase, was he lucky or was he good? One chapter that I have particular interest in, and I know Kori's also written about, is that Lincoln and Seward and the Civil War. Because many people think about generals and battles and maybe social effects and now slavery, but they very rarely think about the foreign policy of the Civil War. And we got quite close to British and possibly French intervention, which would have changed the course of history. So how did they avoid that? With Teddy Roosevelt, who's obviously known for San Juan Hill and the Great White Fleet, he was actually a masterful mediator of the Russo-Japanese War and the Moroccan crisis. And that was an example of how he was concerned about the balance of power of his era. Another chapter of interest to both Kori and to me is Charles Evans Hughes and the Washington Naval Conference. And I think many people have looked at this simply as a case of arms control. But yet a deeper study is how he connects it with the regional security agenda of the time, which I think has some applications today. And also, how did he recover the role of foreign policy after the debacle of Wilson with the Versailles Treaty? I also talk about the creation of the new American alliance system in 47, 49, how that came about. And I try to draw particular attention here to some of the under-recognized figures, including Senator Vandenberg, because I wanted to stress the importance of a congressional role in foreign policy. I include a man named Vannevar Bush, who probably wouldn't show up in most foreign policy studies, but I think is particularly important because he's really the father of American science policy, quite important in World War II, I think critical in our success in the Cold War, and going to be very important for the challenges with China, but also topics like pandemics and biological security or climate change. I deal with JFK and his experience with crisis management. I try to go back and understand the critical period in late 1964-65, where LBJ really militarizes the American, takes American control of the Vietnam War. With Nixon and Kissinger, I talk about realpolitik and triangular diplomacy. Ronald Reagan's always a complex figure, I think, for people to understand. They admire him, but one of the challenges is he developed a strong set of convictions through his writing. He did this his whole life, starting out with radio addresses and others. And to understand his style, I think one needs to understand not only his oratory, but how he came to his oratory and how he used that to frame his thinking. But I also think it was a very important role played by former Secretary of State Schultz, because it wasn't enough to speak about it. There was the negotiations that was critical at the end of the Cold War. And my last formal chapter is on George Bush 41 and Baker as alliance leaders at the end of the Cold War. Now I close with trying to identify 5 traditions that I think offer some considerations for the future. And I'll stop with these sort of opening comments. One is the importance of North America. And it's quite interesting. If you look at most foreign policy studies today about future challenges, nobody includes North America. They'll talk about Asia, Europe, Middle East, but obviously it was very important in the 19th century. I make the case for the 20th century. But also as we look ahead, a lot of the challenges of North America are the challenges that the public's interested in. Immigration, economics, organized crime and narcotics issues. And I found this quote from Ronald Reagan in 1979 as he was launching his campaign that said, you know, it's time that we stop thinking about Canada and Mexico as foreigners and instead try to think about them as our closest partners. And I think this is important for the future because we need to see North America as a continental base for our sort of international positioning. A second tradition is trade, transnationalism, and technology. And here, what I'm stressing is from the founding of the United States, people have seen trade as more than a matter of economic efficiency. They saw it as a critical part of America's connectivity with the world, including through the role of private sector players. And that's this particular dimension that the United States brought to world foreign policy. The third topic is alliances, which the United States avoided for its first 150 years. Kori and I have talked about the near case of at the time of the Monroe Doctrine, but still, I think the fact that we didn't go into an alliance with Britain becomes critical for the next 100 years. But then from 47 to 49, there's a sharp shift. And I think it's important to recognize what happened. We created a different type of alliance system. And it was political, economic, diplomatic. Vandenberg actually stresses this as much as it was military. For the next 70 years, much of our foreign policy experience, including people on this call, have been, how do you try to manage that? And that's an interesting question today. Will we still rely on this alliance system, or will it change and be adapted, or will we move to something different? The fourth tradition is the critical need for congressional and public support. Again, many foreign policy specialists sort of always leave out the congressional sort of public support nature. I think this is going to be important not only for today, but if you look at the chapters in the book, starting with Ben Franklin, it's critical for the success all throughout the historical experience. And finally, I close with the tradition of America's purpose. And here, I'm not talking about exceptionalism. In fact, I had a SICE seminar, it might have been with Frank, where we got some negative reactions because it seems it has a certain smugness from the US perspective. But my argument is, from the very founding of the United States, there was a sense that the country was to serve a larger purpose. And the best way I try to remind people of this is that if you still carry a wallet, take out a dollar bill, look on the back, and you'll see the Great Seal of the United States, which otherwise you wouldn't know what that was. And as part of that seal, you'll see this unfinished pyramid and the phrase below, Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. So from the start, people in the United States were thinking about something quite big. And my view is the purpose changes over time. At first, it was just to protect a republic in a world of empires. And part of the ongoing story of the United States is, how does that purpose evolve? And what will it be for the future? So maybe that's a good place to stop.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Professor Gavin, tell us what you're thinking about this book. What questions have you?
Well, thank you, Dr. Shaki, for putting this on. It's a tremendous event. And Bob, congratulations. This is a really outstanding accomplishment. I've had the honor to see several iterations of this book presented. That seminar that you mentioned was for our SICE students, which was my first exposure to it. But Bob was generous enough both to participate in another dinner seminar in American exceptionalism, and then again present one of his chapters to our PhD students in the IPSCON seminar. There's a whole lot of things that I love about this book, and there's three big themes in particular that I'm interested in hearing more about. The first is the focus on individuals, leadership, and critical choices. I have to confess that I think young people anymore, when they're exposed to international relations and foreign policy, since they typically get it in a political science class, they're more likely to hear about large themes and impersonal structural forces, and to look at things like that are of course important, like the balance of power, geography, larger tectonic forces. But I love the focus on individuals here, and I think that's really good. A second is something that you mentioned, and I hadn't thought about a lot, but we forget about the importance, and you mentioned North America, but I think of the Americas in general, which is, I would love to hear more about why it is we as a country have moved away from this focus on the Americas as a focal point of our grand strategy, which of course, for at least the first century and a half, was really our main focus. The final thing, and this is the one that I think I would love to sort of tease out more. You, of course, have had an extraordinary career in economic statecraft. And one of the things about this book that I think really highlighted for me is that when Americans and leaders pursue American economic statecraft, it's not just about economics. That you highlight in the tradition of American diplomacy, economics is a tool not just for material gain, but embedded in its use of economic tools is a larger sort of worldview, a larger idea. And so I would love to hear more about that. Those are sort of kind of the broad things that most struck me. I have a lot of specific questions, but I would love to get your reaction to those.
So Kori, do you want me to respond or? Okay, well, first, on the point about individuals and leadership, you're correct. This is not only apparent in the way I've written a book, but there's a sub-theme in my own thinking, which is that probably like many people on this call, I enjoy reading the theoretical frameworks that people come up with, and I understand that's probably how they often will advance careers. But when I ask myself, when I was dealing with challenges of German unification or how to get the World Trade System going, or frankly, the Global Climate Change Treaty in '92, which is the only one that's ever sort of been ratified by the Senate. Those theoretical frameworks don't give you much guidance. What you're actually trying to do is you're trying to address the problems of a day. And what I try to explain from the start is the pragmatism that is also, interestingly enough, an American philosophy, a contribution to American philosophy, sort of leads people to say, look, let me try to understand the context. Power, whether it's economic, military, votes, what are the institutions and processes? How do they work? What are the other players? What are their positions? And how should we try to approach it? What do I want to get done? And I think the reality is that it's still a good accomplishment if you can try to address some of these problems and achieve even what might be imperfect results in a far from perfect world. So sometimes the theoretical constructs sort of enable people to sort of debate, offshore balancing or various forms of realism and so on and so forth. And I just don't think that's the reality of how most people deal with these issues. It doesn't mean that those aren't useful devices, but I was partly trying to instruct for people interested in history or people that might be interested in policy making sort of 200 years of experience about how people have really dealt with these. And people can say how they would have approached the positions of Charles Evans Hughes after the defeat of Versailles, where the Senate basically says, it doesn't matter who's Secretary of State, we're gonna run the show anyway. And all of a sudden he manages to get a bunch of treaties through the Senate with a structure that doesn't survive, but it's important to understand why it doesn't survive. And in some ways there could be lessons there about arms control and regional security that you could apply to North Korea today or Iran today. On the Americas, as the United States grew as a power, we tended to take the position at home for granted, but it keeps forcing itself on us. So obviously the 19th century people know well, but in the case of the 20th century, many people are unaware. We almost went to war with Mexico again in 1916. We have this wonderful example where with the Zimmerman telegram, where before World War I starts, the Germans proposed to the Mexicans to join in fighting the United States and they can recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. For some reason, they leave out California. I never could figure out exactly why. But then if you think about the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Caribbean, sort of the major atomic nuclear weapon showdown of the Cold War, that's in right off our shore. And I think to understand something like NAFTA, if you take the comment that I quoted from Reagan, it's important to understand that was much more than a trade agreement. It was trying to embrace a modernizing Mexico and a changing Mexico. And frankly, that's going to be very applicable today. I think there's problems south of the border that are going to plague the United States and undermine security. But I also believe there's this positive point, which is that if you can imagine the continental base of the United States and Canada and Mexico as being 500 million people, 3 democracies, energy self-sufficiency and exports, better demographics than the rest of the world. Frankly, if we focus on the workforce potential, I'm starting to sound like Kori Shaki. You could become quite optimistic about our future in this, but it's a mindset. And I mean, to give you a practical example of this, Frank, if we do negotiate some trade agreement with Great Britain, I would do it with the 3 North American countries. When Vice President Biden said, buy America, why not make it buy North America? So it's a context in which you try to understand not only the challenges that come, whether environmental or narcotics, immigration, but how we can make this into a plus. As for the larger Americas, I use Henry Clay as a wonderful example of kind of the cycles where there's always hope and disappointment. And I cite this wonderful case where he and John Quincy Adams spent most of a session of Congress trying to get two delegates sort of confirmed against the Jacksonians. One dies along the way and the other arrives too late. And that's kind of the example of our experience with Latin America. But you'll see people, whether it was Elihu Root or Bill Clinton or others, or the Bushes, who wanted to try to see how we can strengthen our overall position in the Americas. And finally, your point on economic statecraft is, in a sense, this is the start of the United States. I mean, what I found quite interesting is in 1776, when Jefferson is working on that Declaration of Independence, John Adams serves on that committee, but he's chairing another committee, and it's the model treaty for the United States, and it's basically a trade agreement. Now, it's important to understand the context. The context is, this is a new republic born in a world of empires and mercantilism. They're trying to create space for a different approach to foreign policy that would involve private actors. And that's a point I want to stress. Even today, when people talk about turmoil in the United States or frustrations with the White House, I often point out, remember what happens in the private sector, how it revolutionized energy or the innovation and others. This is also part of the sort of American dynamism. And that's also why I included the chapter on Van Eberbush, because I think this point about technology and innovation, in a way, we sometimes talk about geopolitics, we talk about economics, but we haven't figured out science and technology effectively. And there are different challenges in how you incorporate those. It's coincidental, but I worked on some of these issues either at the World Bank or with the climate change, and it's a different policy context. So this is a book that tries to bring these themes together, but also help people think about it as a practitioner.
Our brands.
Thanks, Kori. It's a real pleasure to be part of this discussion. I like Frank, I really enjoyed the book, and it's one of those rare books that manages to be both entertaining and analytical in equal measure. And so it's a lot of fun. And I was thrilled to see that you were sticking up for diplomatic history and diplomatic historians as well. So I had 3 or 4 questions, or maybe they're comments with question marks at the end of them that perhaps you could address. And a couple of them relate to points that Frank made, and a couple of them go in different directions. And so I would just be interested in hearing more about how to think of the concept of pragmatism, which you put it at the heart of the book. And you do, I think, a very good job in the chapters of illustrating pragmatism at work, but I could imagine that the concept might provoke 2 questions from skeptics. And so one question might be, if you define pragmatism too narrowly, then it just becomes synonymous with pursuing the national interest. And then what's distinctive about that? Isn't every country pragmatic in that sense? Stalin is a pragmatist as well. And so what purchase does that give us on American foreign policy? The second question goes in a somewhat different direction, which is, could you say more about how in the book you reconcile the pragmatic tradition with the fact that Americans are among the most ideological people on earth? And so it's not every country out there that believes that it has a special calling to redeem humanity, and yet the United States does. It's not every country out there that obsesses about the role of its values in foreign policy, and yet the United States does that. And so could you just perhaps say a bit more about how you think about that reconciliation in the book? A second question has to do, so I appreciated very much your answer to Frank's question about the development of the idea of a North American continental base. I wonder maybe if you could now look forward as opposed to backward and talk about what the prospects for realizing that objective are in the future, because you can tell one story where the United States, despite some bumps along the way, has made just enormous progress in this regard, where if you were to go back 100 years, as you noted, anti-Americanism was far more rife, not only in Mexico, but in Canada than it is right now. And over the past 3 or 4 decades, we've achieved much greater integration and cooperation on a variety of dimensions than we ever had before. You can also tell a story where there is tremendous friction within the North American community today over issues such as trade and immigration and a variety of other things. And so I wonder how you think about those two issues in considering the future. The third point I hope you might be able to say a little bit more about is the point you make, which I love, which is that the United States has the ability to shape domestic opinion in foreign societies. And I know that this point is near and dear to Kori's heart as well, because she talks about it so ably in her book, Safe Passage, and it actually relates to the discussion that you were having earlier about the Civil War, and that one of the reasons why the British don't end up intervening on the side of the Confederacy in the American Civil War is precisely because of this American ability to exert influence on foreign populations. So could you say a little bit more about that issue and the importance of it over time? And then the last thing I would just raise, one of the most interesting parts of the book, to my mind, is the discussion of the evolving American approach to issues of alliances and partnerships, where obviously the alliance with France is critical in the winning of American independence. And then in a very cynical fashion, we turn around and basically sell the French out as soon as we can. And for the next 150 years after that, we forswear formal peacetime alliances, even though we have all sorts of partnerships and geopolitical dalliances with other countries when it suits us. And then, as you point out, after World War II, something changes. And in the space of just a few years, we build an alliance system that's not only unprecedented in our own history, but in anybody else's history either. And it strikes me that the nature of those alliances is also different than many alliances that had come before, because they were intended, at least after the first 15 years or so, to be quasi-permanent, right? They weren't alliances of expedient, and they were as much about reassuring and tamping down tensions between our allies as they were about defending those countries from our enemies. And so it's just a fascinating theme that runs throughout the book. What brought it to mind in reading the book just a couple days ago was, as I'm sure you saw, there was a very ambitious statement given by Steve Biegun, basically mooting the idea that the Quad, this democratic partnership between the U.S., Australia, Japan, and India, might become some sort of Indo-Pacific NATO, some sort of formal alliance in the future. And so combining your understanding of the historical trajectory of America's alliances with your understanding of current U.S. policy, could you situate some of the discussions that we're having about the Quad and other American partnerships and alliances today within this longer historical trajectory? And I'll stop there.
So I don't know if this is symbolic, and I apologize if it's creating noise, but I've got a thunderstorm outside. So, so on the first point on pragmatism, I don't mean to suggest that others aren't pragmatic. So none of these things are absolutely unique. What I'm trying to do with the idea is to suggest that I think the American experience has shown a particular disposition about not getting too involved with abstractions, dogmas, kind of universal timeless truths, and instead trying to figure out the practical consequences of what works. And this, of course, has to account for chance and contingency, and it's an experimentation instead of a dynamism. And as I mentioned in the answer to Frank, there's actually a method with this, which is I've tried to describe about trying to understand the facts on the ground and not try to force messy facts into what are preconceived intellectual structures. And as to the point about the relation to ideology, I think that the nature of American pragmatism is not to dismiss ideas. As you say, ideas are quite important in the American experience. It's just not to take them over the cliff, or sometimes we do, and then I give some examples of kind of sort of that experience, but instead to say, look, if we can make advances, if we can, achieve some opportunities and gains, whether it's for democracy or freedom or free societies, and be more practical about how much of that is economic, how much of that is support from others, how much of it is sort of movement of ideas. And there's a certain optimism about this, I have to say. So this is another Shaki point, I guess, which would be sort of the idea that history offers insights on how to do better, as opposed to the notion of acceptance of timeless obstacles. So not to lapse into the theory here, but some of the theoretical structures of realism and others sort of assume we're preordained to have certain sort of reactions here. And at least my reading of the history is, people take the circumstances they have to deal with, they kind of try to understand what's happened before, and they try to figure out a way to address the problem. There's a challenge, which Kissinger has always pointed out, which is that if you get too case by case, you become sort of strategically nihilist. And so I also try to talk about the role of vision and frameworks. And another point that Kissinger makes is some problems can only be managed. And I think one has to recognize that. So I'm not trying to come up with a new doctrine. I'm just sharing the observations of kind of how I've seen reality work and sort of how it worked across history. As for the looking forward and the prospects for North America, you sort of touched on, I think, a critical point of the historical perspective, which is all three North American countries have a very strong sense of sovereignty and independence. And so the nature of integration, as designed really starting out in the 80s in the United States, had to recognize that respect for sovereignty and independence. And because the United States was the most powerful country, it was most effective when it showed some sensitivity to this in dealing with Mexico and Canada. That's a very different model than the European Union notion of shared sovereignty. And we're seeing some of the struggles that go forward with it. But again, if I try to translate this to practical decisions, I was on a call about a week ago with the Mexican negotiator of NAFTA, who I had worked with. And he was bemoaning that the newest USMCA, the successor to NAFTA, lessens the investment protections. And what he recognized, and what I recognized at the time we did NAFTA, was that we're partly trying to import rule of law into Mexico through the NAFTA agreement. And in a sense, this administration, Ambassador Lighthizer, didn't want investment in Mexico. Now, my own view is we're going to be stronger if we've got a healthy Mexico, as Reagan said, and not only in terms of dealing with the problems of North America, but dealing with global problems. And going back, Hal, to your observation, I was struck that in the 80s, when I started to deal with Mexico and foreign policy, if I'd left my briefing book behind and I needed to know the Mexican position, I would just have the US position and put a minus sign in front of it, because the Mexican foreign ministry had been where they put all the leftist intellectuals, and their basic position was oppose the United States. By 2001, my closest partners in dealing with trade were the Mexican and Canadian counterparts, and we worked in league globally. So it's one of these points where, people talk about some of Thucydides's famous quotes, but he also had one that said, we win our friends by doing favors, not by asking them. And that's part also of this notion of the partnership that you're developing. And by the way, there's another point. I'm writing a piece for an online edition of Foreign Affairs that should be out in a couple of weeks. I've always thought that a more positive policy towards Mexico would be good in terms of the Latino community, Hispanic community in the United States, and it's better for the politics. So this is like a diamond for people who, if you want to pick up the Southwestern states, this is, I personally think this is one of the sad differences between the Bush approaches towards Hispanics and the Trump approach. I think you're going to lose that voting community. So there's a nice domestic political connection here as well. On the third one, the effects about sort of foreign thinking. Again, Kori, as you properly said, points this out. There's a development of an Anglo-American public opinion. And, you know, because many of us were schooled in the world of special relationships, some people assume this. You can't assume it. I mean, it was actually, there was a lot of friction and conflict. And some of the stories that we told, I mean, my story with Charles Evans Hughes and Balfour is kind of an interesting example of kind of, it goes back to something that Alexander Hamilton says. He says, which we think in English. And by the way, Hamilton's a wonderful exemplar of this, because he actually is about 100 years ahead of his time. He tries to come, he talks to some of the representatives of the British government, and he's trying to develop, in a sense, a strategic dialogue, or what today we would call a special relationship. The British Prime Minister at the time, Lord Shelburne, had a similar idea, but neither can carry it politically. It does, so, but over time, we build this sort of attitude. And I would suggest that this is, again, an example of the influence of American society, not just the government. If you think about Black Lives Matter today, if you think about different social movements, if you think about this in the 60s and 68, they had a resonance globally. So this is one of the aspects of a free society, that, you know, we have a turmoil that you don't have inside China or Russia, but it can become quite influential if we deal with our problems at home. And this was also part of the story of the civil rights movement sort of during the Cold War. So it does bring back to the challenge that foreign policy works if we make America work at home, and we create an exemplar for globally. As for your point about the alliance system, the first point, Hal, which I think you probably know, but many people are unaware of, you know, Marshall and Atchison and Truman and Vandenberg and Will Clayton, another man I resurrect from the misty past, they didn't come out in 46 and 47 and say, well, here's the alliance design we're going to create. They dealt first with an economic problem in Western Europe that they hadn't foreseen, and they come up with the Marshall Plan as the design for it, in part to avoid a military alliance. Second, they realize it won't work unless they have Germany be part of it. So then they have the Federal Republic of Germany. That creates an anxiety in France, and it creates the Berlin crisis for the Soviets. So then you build NATO on top of it. So you have, within 3 years, what are really a series of practical decisions that create a system. And what some of the later chapters talk about is, how do you make that system work? So I have the chapter on Berlin and JFK is one example. Vietnam is another example. How far do you extend that commitment sort of as alliance partners? And I guess to your point about the sort of Indo-Pacific design, I'll reference something that actually Kissinger said at a session not long ago. You might have been there, Frank. Is that you know, one of the sad things about the breakdown of our relationship with Europe is that while at times dealing with European allies can be frustrating and they will bring different perspectives, we're probably stronger in the long run if we get their perspective. So what I would say to people who talk about an Indo-Pacific alliance is, if you're going to do that, you're going to have some sense how they view China. And I'm not sure they can buy into the decoupling and constant confrontation model that we have. So as a concept, working with allies and partners, taking into account the views of India and Australia and Japan and South Korea and others in Southeast Asia, I like that idea. I'm not exactly sure that's what we're doing these days. And if so, we're approaching it in a way that sort of assumes a unipolarity. And I'll close with this point. One of the chapters I have is on Bush 41 and Baker. And I titled that one kind of the alliance leader, because in some ways it's not only interesting to see what he did to end the Cold War in Europe and the Gulf War, but he's really, more than historians have recognized, creates the foundation stones for the next two presidencies: NAFTA, Uruguay Round, APEC, the Global Climate Change Treaty, Mideast peace process. Now, his model was not a model of hegemony. It wasn't a model of a unipolar world. It was a model of networks and partnerships where the United States was the key node in the network. And I think one of the tragedies today is the United States extends its powers if it works with other partners. And that's not been the view that we've been pursuing in past years.
So before I get to my questions, Bob, we just got a great question in from a listener, which is, you mentioned that American diplomacy is not overly influenced by dogma. In this context, what should the role of America be in promoting values such as democracy, enhancement of women's rights?
Yeah, well, when people read the book, they'll see that this notion of America's purpose and the aspirations of America are also an important theme. So again, trying to use the framework, I'm not taking sort of a traditional sort of realist view on this. The chapter on Reagan is important in this, but so is the chapter on John Quincy Adams. Because what John Quincy Adams, I think it was James Traub who first referred to this, is an American realist. And what that meant was, John Quincy Adams was very intent on having a continental United States, which, by the way, was no small historical achievement. Who else has managed to do this other than Australia, I guess? But he also had the notion of a republic and the role of liberty. His view, however, was that Latin America, and for that matter, Europe, didn't have the capacity and institutions to do so. It's a very important distinction, which is, he said, it's the concept that the right to have self-determination and freedom is not the same as having the capacity. And I think whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or our experiences in other parts of the world, we have to recognize that. But it doesn't mean that we step back from those issues. And I personally, I'll give you a practical example today. In Hong Kong, rather than sanctioning more and more people so we can't talk to them, I would take the British approach and say, let's let some of those people come to the United States if they wish. That's the best way to show the difference between these two societies. Reagan was quite skillful with the Russian people about seeing freedom as an aspiration. Today, if you look at our diplomacy with China, freedom is used as a club. It's a way to insult them. It's the way to say, you know, we need to break off from you. That's a very different approach than people who've tried to believe that standing for whether liberty or freedom of religion or other issues needs to be part of the diplomacy. And I guess I'd wrap that together by saying, you have to approach this pragmatically. There are ways you can make openings for freedom of religion, try to support the context for democratic reform. I've spent a lot of my career on the economic side, you know, as well as dealing with security issues. And frankly, it's a lot harder to create sustained democracies if you don't have some economic progress and some creation of institutions, some of the things that Frank Fukuyama has sort of written about. But the point is, it takes time, it takes effort. So it's this potion about you can make advances for America's aspirations in the world, creating that notion of Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new kind of world order under Bush 41. But you have to be practical in how you can make the advances. And I'll use Mexico as another good example of that.
So we've talked about the book a lot, but you haven't told any of the specific stories you tell in the book. And I'd like to ask you to tell one, because I thought particularly interesting was your discussion of America's fraught relationship with international law. And I really liked the way you tell the story about the International Court coming on the heels of the Versailles Treaty and the struggles. And after you tell that story, I'd love for you to apply your practical statecraft and tell us whether we should ratify the law of the sea treaty. And if so, how might a Secretary of State get that done?
So on the first case, I refer to this as the venerable but vexed tradition of America with international law. And for those who are skeptics, go back and read the Declaration of Independence, which talks about the laws of nature and basically is a legal indictment of George III when you sort of go through the steps. But I think that, and there's early interesting efforts where I think it was the Jay Treaty of 1795 has some of the first international arbitration provisions. The Russ-Bagehot Accord with Britain dealing with the Canadian border is kind of the first naval disarmament in modern sort of times, which leads to quite a successful thing, which is a disarmed border across with our northern neighbor. But I think when you start to get to the people like Ella Heroot, which you mentioned too, or Charles Evans Hughes, it's important to understand the context of the times. And this goes back a little bit to Hell's question, which is they're trying to avoid the balance of power politics of Europe. They're trying to avoid the League of Nations. They're trying to avoid alliances because that was not publicly acceptable in the United States at that time. As all of you know, we joined World War I as an associated power, not an allied power. And so they're trying, part of the story of the first 150 years is how do you engage internationally with different methods? And international law is one of those stories and methods. Part of the international law tradition is the experience we had with Cuba and the Philippines, which people can find their criticism, but it's quite interesting at a time that Europe was trying to extend empires. Basically, we're trying to create a constitutional structure while also taking account of security interests, as was the case with the Platt Amendment in Cuba and with the Philippines, where I think we bring all the Bill of Rights there except the right to bear arms and jury trials. And so it's part of going back to your question about how you influence these things over time. As for the World Court actually appears to have been relatively popular in public opinion during the 20s and 30s. But the struggle is to get the 2/3 vote of the Senate for ratification. And the Hearst newspapers perennially run attacks on it. So the Senate comes up with a series of reservations, and Root gets 4 of the 5 done and almost gets 1 more done, but never quite is able to cross the finish line on that. And there's a debate, obviously, continuing today among foreign policy and international law scholars that I tried to capture. I found a wonderful dialogue with Anne-Marie Slaughter and 2 of her colleagues on the centennial of the formation of the American Association of International Law. And one view is, well, international law only works with democracies. Another view is international law can actually discipline democracies. And a third view was, look, the problem was until you create security stability, this just won't work in the system. So the debate continues. Well, where I tried to bring it to more of a modern period was to say, look, if you consider the regimes and institutions that we have for trade, or for that matter, scientific or pandemics or a whole host of things that are now commonplace, they're built on the rules-based order, the international rules system. So in a sense, that's what international law has evolved to. But the key point I was trying to stress was these were not utopians. So in my footnote, I give credence. John Bolton wrote an article on this that'll take a different view back in 2000. But these are very practical people trying to deal with the problems of their era and trying to see how these cooperative structures could support. I think that in essence, the modern alliance system that we created, that we've sort of talked about here, which had economic components as well as military components, in some ways it's subsumed some of this discussion. And to go back to that point, what's quite interesting, since probably for many of our careers, and I know for Kori, you at the Defense Department, people talk about the importance of the military and the integrated military command. That's true. But when you look at Vandenberg and the early debate, what they emphasize is this is supposed to be a diplomatic and political partnership. And the military is an add-on, which by the way also is another sort of answer to the question of what you try to do in the Indo-Pacific. And then your second one was law of the sea. Well, this is a practical judgment. I mean, the debate, as you know, would be that is law of the sea enough of a customary treaty? My own view is the United States would have been better if it had ratified it. Frankly, many of the principles of the law of the sea would be quite useful in the South China Sea, as we're sort of arguing today. But this is where, as a pragmatist, I'd have to say, how much political capital do I have to do to get it through? And, what's the likelihood that I will accomplish that? It was held up, as you probably know, first with the deep seabed mining regime and some of the complications sort of related to that. So it'd be better if we had it, but I'm not sure, given all the other challenges in the world, it would be #1 priority for me if I were Secretary of State.
Frank, did I see you wanting to get in on this argument?
Yes, I wanted to follow up on your excellent question. And Bob, one of the burdens of writing a broad, synthetic history of American foreign policy is you have to deal with a question that you probably don't want to deal with, but it's the question Kori, Hal, and I have all had to deal with, and you're going to have to deal with when you go in front of an academic or more academic audience than us. That is America.
Is there such a thing?
Yeah, you'll see. Rumor has it you hang out at the AHA, which is in itself, which if you go back, the question you will get, and it will not be asked as friendly as I'm going to ask, is America an empire? If not, explain yourself. If so, what kind of empire and how should we think about it?
So I have been a long proponent that the United States has not and is not an empire. And without getting through all the details, some of the early writing on this, which comes from the Wisconsin school about sort of economic imperialism, would basically suggest that foreign investment and trade and any economic activity is a form of power and imperialism. And I will just point out to you from my 5 years at the World Bank, a lot of countries want trade and investment and private sector connectivity. So personally, I think that approach has been kind of, dismissed over time. There clearly was a period after 1898 with Cuba and the Philippines where we are a colonial power. And I touched on this a little bit with one of the earlier answers. I try to explain in the book kind of how the United States approached that task and how it approached it differently from others. And frankly, it wasn't very successful as a colonial power. By 1916, we want to get rid of the Philippines. So we want to sort of pass it on, but there's a sense of responsibility for how one does that. The Cuba case, of course, is quite interesting because Ella Harut makes the point. Remember, this is a time where other countries are trying to get colonies. We're trying to give Cuba its independence, but we recognize that Cuba is part of our security perimeter. This is the practical reality. So we have this Platt Amendment, and the Platt Amendment basically gives the United States what is supposed to be a limited right to intervene if there's chaos, okay? Now, this is where facts and history are useful to study. What that was dealing with is that the European countries had gone to Venezuela and Mexico and others and said, you're not paying your debts, we're gonna invade you and we're gonna take control of you. That was the reality that these people had to deal with. And Ella Harut says later, I think in the 20s or 30s, he says, you cannot understand the Platt Amendment unless you understand Kaiser Wilhelm II. At this point, Imperial Germany was trying to use these opportunities to extend its authority. And so I think there's a good debate about how the United States handled that brief colonial experience and whether it was accepted in the American public. But what has been changed to the Walter Lefebvre or other sort of notion that just because we're a powerful country and deal with security and try to support other countries makes us an empire, I think takes the concept of empire and expands it beyond any reasonable definition. I'm happy to debate that with scholars.
So I don't give a lot of credit to Woodrow Wilson, but reshaping America's relationships with Latin American countries is one of the things he did best. And Franklin Roosevelt ends up the great beneficiary of it during World War II, but Wilson deserves a lot of credit for wrenching it out of the worst period of American colonial overstretch in the region. A question from a listener. I understand we have no treaties in the Middle East. Has that helped or hurt our influence and power in the region?
I would approach it slightly differently. I think the question is, have we had the debate at home through the Congress that commits the American people to the type of security arrangements with these countries. And let me give you a practical example today. The newspapers are full of discussion about some recent articles about should we have a defense arrangement with Taiwan, a different one from the Taiwan Relations Act. I haven't seen any of the articles refer to the fact, how would we do this? Is it a treaty? Is it a joint resolution of Congress, which, by the way, is what Eisenhower did with the Taiwan Straits crisis? Is it a tweet? And if it's none of those things, then kind of, are the American people really behind what has to be a very serious security commitment? So this may be a little old-fashioned, particularly in this stage, but I honestly think the Constitution has a role in these things. Now, you can have partnerships, to come back to the Middle East. I think we have a very deep partnership from history as common interest with the Holocaust with Israel. That will remain. I don't think Israel actually wants a formal alliance because they want to have their sort of freedom of action. And I think that with some of the other Gulf countries, the fact that we don't have a formal alliance system suggests that the nature of these partnerships don't have quite the same depth. And I think that's an accurate description. They've been based more on sort of real calculations about trying to create sort of a certain regional stability. That doesn't mean we don't do them. But as a general matter, one of the themes that I draw out of this book is that foreign policy is more sustainable if we can actually have public debates. This also puts a role for the Congress in these issues. I mean, again, I do think, to take another Eisenhower example, he also did get a joint resolution in dealing with the Middle East, I think before the Lebanon sort of crisis. It's not a bad habit for executives to take. It's not the current view.
Mm-hmm. So in closing, Bob, I'd like to ask, what advice would you give to aspiring American diplomats? As you have told all of these stories of diplomatic successes and struggles, if you were talking to a young woman coming into the Foreign Service, what would you advise her about how to serve the country well?
So first, this won't be a big shock. Read a lot of history. And not only to kind of to know the context of problems and issues, but in the way we've been discussing on this call, to think about the real problem solving. It's easy to talk about empires or themes and others, but so the United States defeats the Spanish fleet off Manila Bay, and then it's a question of the German fleet is hovering. What are we going to do? And Phil Zoellick has written a very good piece about kind of how we ended up sort of taking a position in the Philippines we might not have originally wanted, but people can evaluate the circumstances. The point of it is to think about the experience people have had as problem solvers in real situations with worlds of gray as opposed to sort of black and white. And it goes to another point, Kori, which is that, I've had some senior leadership positions, and what I've always tried to explain to some of the people working with me is think about the perspective from your boss perspective, not sort of just how you analyze it, but what's the problem your boss is trying to solve, and how can you help him or her solve the problem? One of my other famous sort of little retorts was, probably like many of you, I'd have people come into my office, there'd be this outburst of frustration of something, and I would ask people, so what is the question you would like me to address? And what's your recommendation? It's a variation of George Marshall's sort of approach on this. So it's a discipline about trying to think like a decision maker and frame questions. And going back to the young woman we're advising, if you start to think like a decision maker and think about the decisions that your boss has to deal with, you're more likely to become the decision maker.
Bob Zoellick, thank you so much for talking with us about your new book, America in the World. Thank you, Frank Gavin. Thank you, Hal Brands, for your typical intellectual rigor. And thank you all for listening to this conversation with the American Enterprise Institute.
Thanks for having me.